I'm very excited to be here today with Sarah Strickley, editor of Miracle Monocle. Hello, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Of course. So why don't we jump right in? Tell us everything about this magazine. Tell us its history, when it was started, why it was started, and also are you the original founder? Have you been with the magazine from the beginning? So take us through its origin story.
Sure. So the journal was founded, I think, in 2007, 2008, and it lived at a university in Indiana. And then one of our previous department heads moved it to the University of Louisville. And in the beginning, it had its own independent website, but then it became part of the university website. And sort of had a rebirth around 2005, 2006, or I'm sorry, 2015, 2016. I came on board in 2017 with the goal of raising the profile of the journal, expanding it quite a bit, trying out new things, and also building out a training program for students who are interested in literary editing. So the journal is known for its role as an early and frequent host of experimental literatures. So we publish experimental work, hybrids, but we also publish in the traditional categories. Very frequently, though, in those categories, we aim for quite a bit of variety in terms of formal approach. So you might think of us as a place that's accommodating to fabulism, fantastical work. We're not opposed to reading genre work, but we prefer things with a really high quality in terms of the prose style and the writing. Our biggest category by far, we get the most submissions in poetry, followed by fiction. And then we also publish creative nonfiction in a visual arts category. And at some point during our process of expansion, we began publishing reviews. And so one of our bargains that we make with folks who are interested in contributing to our journal is that we will review their new books when they come out. And
Oh, great.
so that offers, mostly small press writers an opportunity to have their work reviewed in a venue. And then somewhere along the way, I decided I wanted to begin offering print materials as well. And so we started publishing themed anthologies. And so we have another one in the works that should be out sometime this year. So we release those in print and digital format. We publish 2 digital issues a year, and then usually about 1 print book a year. But the schedule on that tends to be related to how flush our budget happens to be. So um, it's nice to be able to offer students an opportunity to work in digital and print, and I think they really enjoy the opportunity to have a print product with their names in the masthead and all of that. So um, let's see. In terms of where we're headed, we are working on a project to move the journal off of the university platform and into an independent web space. And this is part of an initiative to expand what we're able to do. We've been a little limited in terms of the
Mm.
university platform. So this will allow us to begin publishing work that might be, video or other
Oh, cool.
visual mediums. We weren't able to do that on our old university web
Mhm.
platform.
Mm.
And we'd like to move toward establishing ourselves as a nonprofit as well.
Mhm.
So it's a gradual expansion
Mhm.
process, and we're taking baby steps along the way to make sure that we can maintain the growth.
Mhm.
But it's been exciting to see the journal change and grow over the course of my years as the
Very.
faculty editor.
And will that change the funding somehow if you switch from the university platform to an independent one?
We actually receive very little funding from the
Mm.
universities. We're funded mainly through donations. We do a
Okay.
crowdfunding campaign every year. Um, so, of course, the university pays for me to exist and
Mhm.
persist. But beyond that, we don't receive any funding from the university.
Mhm.
I do think that establishing ourselves as a nonprofit will open us to more funding opportunities, grants,
Mhm.
things like that that are not accessible to us in this moment. So that's something I'm looking forward to.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe entering a new tier, a new funding tier at that
Hmm. Hmm. Sure. So does the magazine charge submission fees?
We spent about a decade not doing that. And then last year, we decided to experiment with small fees
Yeah.
for a couple of reasons. So we don't charge fees across all categories.
Yeah.
So writers who are interested in submitting to our anthologies can submit for free. Any student writers who are interested in entering one of our competitions can enter those for free. And sometimes we'll have free open windows. But for the previous issue cycle and this one, we started charging between $2 and $3 for
Hmm.
submissions.
Hmm.
Um, you probably know how submittable works, so we only
Hmm.
receive a
Yeah.
fraction of funding in return for that service.
Hmm.
But the impact has been dramatic in terms of the submissions that we're seeing. I think they've just become far more appropriate for the journal. In the past, we were dealing with a very high volume of submissions that were not compatible with
Hmm.
what we do. Like, for example, we don't publish full-length novels. We don't publish plays. And so I think adding a submission fee puts a little pause in
Hmm.
the process for writers to consider if this might be a good venue for them, if we
Right.
do match vibes.
Hmm.
But I don't love it. So I do feel like it's in a weird ethical space.
Hmm.
So my goal is to shift gears at some point, although I'm not really sure what will happen. So it's always
Yeah.
a process. We'll try something out. Does it work for us or not?
Hmm.
And then we'll try something else. So this issue cycle, we tried $3 per submission. And I noticed that the kinds of submissions were far more appropriate to the journal, which
Interesting.
made reading submissions a far more pleasurable
Right.
experience for us.
Right. That's so interesting because you mentioned crowdfunding, and I was thinking, oh, that's such a great alternative to submission fees. And I've been just sort of wondering generally, why do these magazines charge the fees? And
Yes.
the fees are going up, and more magazines are
Mhm.
starting to charge them. But the idea that it actually, and some editors think of it like in terms of creating a little friction in the
Yeah,
process, so it forces writers to actually target their submissions more appropriately. So that's
yeah,
really interesting.
yeah. And it was an experiment. I kind of, I was interested to see if it had that
Mhm.
impact. I think, sometimes it's the case that the ease of submissions is such,
Right.
and we're unsubmittable, and so we have that discoverability. We read about 1,000 submissions a year, and that is really about as much as we can handle. We were reading 1,000 submissions a semester, and that was making us insane. So we
Mhm.
sort of dialed back. We read about 100 submissions in each category. And so it's really important that those submissions be likely candidates for, or
Mhm.
more likely candidates for publication
Mhm.
when we're restricted to 100 submissions in that category. And so we had problems with writers submitting many, many times, in many different categories with the same piece in different categories. And so
Mhm.
I think just putting that little friction point in, that little pause to think,
Right.
is this place right for me? Am I likely to publish here?
Mhm.
Has been beneficial. But I would like to experiment with other strategies to get the same kind of
Mhm.
results.
Yeah, makes sense. So how did you get involved with the magazine? Because I think also people sometimes wonder how they can step into editorial positions. It sounds like you weren't there from the beginning, and at some point you got involved. So how did that take place?
So I've been in this business for a really long time. I started out on the staff of Quarter After Eight. I
Oh.
served in the staff of the Iowa Review. I
Mhm.
was on the staff of Barrel House. And I took a little detour from academia and worked in the magazine world. So I worked in a trio of fine art magazines for about a
Mhm.
decade. And then I went back to school and got my PhD. and just sort of chanced into this position. So I wish there was, so I had the background, I was prepared to take on a
Mhm.
role like this one. But the previous editor was hired to another institution and left, and I was there. So I think
Mhm.
having the credentials and being there
Mhm.
were the keys to that.
Right.
But I would say even when I didn't have an institutionally affiliated journal to work on, I found it very easy to serve as a reader for
Mhm.
journals because so many of them are looking for that.
Mhm.
And it is a lot of work, and typically there's no compensation. But it's a way to stay involved in the conversation. And I
Mhm.
also feel like it's massively instructive for writers.
Mhm.
So for me, I'm mostly a fiction writer. So if
Mhm.
I'm reading 100 fiction submissions every semester, I'm paying attention to the moves writers are making
Mhm.
and where things go wrong, where they go right,
Mhm.
and importing that information back into my own practices
Right.
and also my teaching pedagogy. So,
Mhm.
like for example, we just are in the process of making final picks for our fiction category for this issue cycle, and so we read 100 fiction manuscripts.
Mhm.
And something we found so frequently, and this is so frustrating, we were getting really long stories, which is great. I love long stories. I'm liking that things are trending back in that direction,
Mhm.
but to invest the time into a 30-page story wherein there's no synthesis.
Right.
So there's some stuff happening and there are interesting characters, but the writer hasn't quite figured out how to synthesize the parts.
Mhm.
So the story just sort of like abruptly ends. And
Mhm.
it's so tragic because these are pieces we love and really want to say yes to. Um, but killing everyone off is not a satisfying solution for most readers at the
Right.
end of the story.
So tempting.
Yes. And then they died.
Right, right. That's really interesting. So that's actually something I've never heard an editor say before. So one point of clarification, is there a word count for prose submissions?
So I think we set up to 10,000 words, which
Oh,
is really
wow.
big.
Yeah.
So that's approaching, novella length.
Hmm.
And we do occasionally publish a piece that's around 50 pages.
Hmm.
That's only happened once, and we just loved it so much.
Yeah.
That we made a special exception and we designed it beautiful. We made it into a digital download so that it could travel a little further by email. So we made it, like a book, but it was embedded within the issue.
Mm.
Generally speaking, we see a range of lengths. Usually they're around, the 10-page to
Mhm.
25-page length. So since we're, publishing in an online space, we're not limited budgetarily by page count. So
Mhm.
that determination usually isn't what we're focusing on. But we do like to think about like how long can we reasonably predict that a reader will continue reading something online?
Right,
You can very easily pop over to TikTok or
right.
whatever. So for a longer piece, we really like to see a story that really earns that extra
Mhm.
space in one
Mhm.
way or another.
So let's go back to the synthesis thing, because that is
Mhm.
so interesting. So let's explore that. What do you mean? Is it like a piece where there are all these kind of disparate elements and they're all maybe interesting, but then there's no tie up or there's no justification for those elements being there?
So I guess I like to think of it this way, like, like the plot's happening on a
Hmm.
horizontal axis and it's happening in a roughly chronological, fashion. There can
Right.
be flashbacks, so there might be movements backward in time, but mostly there's a forward thrust of things happening.
Mhm.
And I like to think of character as working on a vertical plane. So we're mining down into the character's interiority and getting that complexity that we want to see. And so you want to have movement on both planes. And I think that, some writers are going to privilege one over the other. And that's, a matter of subjective taste. Some readers might prefer stories that have quite a bit of movement on the horizontal plane, lots of stuff happening, boom, 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 boom. And some might prefer a story that really is mining down into that interiority, and that's the
Mhm.
focus of the storytelling. But I think you need to feel the connection between those two planes. Like the
Mhm.
things that are happening reveal character, and character is connected to what
Right.
happens in the plot. And if you don't have a turn on one level or the other, we're sort of left in this space of unbecoming. And so that's not to say that it can't be the case that a character might have an opportunity for change and then not. That
Mhm.
could be interesting.
Sure.
But it's like there's all this interesting complexity, and we don't need like complete resolution, but we need some sense that
Mhm.
something has changed between
Right.
A and T.
This is fascinating. This is another thing I've never heard anybody describe. Like, so the characters sort of intersecting with the story and they're moving on different planes, but they both need to come to some kind of the plot plane and the character plane need to intersect and evolve in a way that's satisfying.
Right. And so, it's some stories you might have a character who changes quite a bit, and
Right.
that can be thrilling. But I think if you're in, nitty gritty realist mode,
Hmm.
most people don't change in that way. And
Hmm.
so we wouldn't make the demand that we need to see someone do a 180 in order
Right.
to feel satisfied. But we have to feel like there are stakes in the storytelling,
Hmm.
that the writer has chosen this period in time to show us out of all of the periods in time possible, for a reason. Um, and sometimes I think not arriving at that synthesis point has to do with the need on the writer's point to shift the viewfinder a little bit, like maybe move a little closer to the action.
Hmm.
So, and this is something that happens with me. I might have to write 20 pages to figure out where the most appropriate or advantageous entry point to the storytelling is.
Hmm.
But oftentimes, on the receiving end of submissions, we're just getting those 20 pages of exploration.
Right.
And I feel like it ends, and I'm like, but this is where it really starts.
Right.
I just
Right.
want to shift the viewfinder over so I can see what happens next.
So how do you square, because it sounds to me like what you're describing is kind of a conventional narrative structure, and how do you square that with wanting experimental stories? Because this is something I kind of beat
Mm-hmm.
myself up for when I'm like, oh, my character needs to change and evolve. And then I think like, oh, that's so corny. That's what all stories demand, do something
Yeah.
different. But how do you sort of balance those? Because I think it is a natural desire for to see the
Mhm.
character change and grow. But it's also exciting when something more experimental is happening.
Yes. So this is something I think about a lot in my own writing practice, because I like to shake things up a little bit, in
Mhm.
terms of structure. And I often build stories in parts. And some of those parts might be
Mhm.
operating in very different modalities than others. They might happen in different time frames. They might have different character points of view. There might be a short story with pieces that are receipts or
Mm.
uh, reviews on Etsy listings.
Mhm.
Am I the asshole listings? I'm thinking of a story I published recently. And so I think the way I think about it is that it's a risk to take
Mhm.
away traditional character realization. But the reward, I think, is refreshing and renewing the reader's
Mhm.
sense of what a story can do.
Mhm.
But you have to like, while you're taking this away, you have to give them something
Yes.
else, you know.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
it's about like maintaining that balance. So
Right.
if I'm not going to give you like embodied characters,
Mhm.
um, then what am I giving you instead?
Mhm. Mhm.
And often for me as an editor, what works is just gorgeous writing.
Yeah.
So I'm going to hang in because the writing itself is so compelling, and I
Mhm.
want to see what's going to happen. But also, an element of surprise should never be underestimated.
Mhm.
So if a writer is able to pull something off that I don't see coming, and that relates to somehow to the experiment they're performing in terms of form, that's a real sweet spot for me as an editor, because it's something I aspire to as a writer.
Mhm.
And I think like conceptually, those wins are really hard won. Like there's a bit of serendipity to it. Like you figure it out by fumbling around with it. Um, that's usually how it comes for me. But then I
Mhm.
also think some writers have a concept going in and they're able to maintain control over pacing and timing in
Mhm.
such a way that they can surprise uh, a reader who's reading even very carefully
Mhm.
with a quick turn.
Yeah. So it sounds like what excites you also is the structural experimentation.
Mhm.
So the
Absolutely.
all of these elements like the character, the pacing, the character's evolution, it's exciting for you as an editor and a reader when it's presented in like a original container.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And something we've been discussing a lot as a staff is in a very concept forward piece,
Mhm.
you still want to reward repeat visits.
Mm.
You know, like if
Mhm.
the story relies entirely on its concept,
Mhm.
then the surprise dissipates upon a return visit.
Right, right.
But if it's artfully rendered and it isn't leaning 100% into that concept, then if there's enough detail and texture, then I think you can come back to a piece again and again and it'll give you more.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. So what typically provides that texture, do you think? Is it the metaphors, motifs, language?
I think oftentimes it is something happening on the level of language,
Hmm.
and it might be a certain kind of lyricism.
Mm.
Maybe it's a prose writer reaching into the poet's toolbox
Hmm.
to borrow some very dense lyricism.
Mm.
But then I think it's also just really pressurizing word choice and
Hmm.
image.
Mm.
So something I talk about with my students a lot when I'm trying to explain like why image is an access point that's so productive for readers. I you know it, so this is a really weird analogy, but I feel like it works really well. So sometimes when you go to the zoo when you're a kid, you can buy these little gelatin capsules, and inside of them there are foam creatures that pop
Yeah.
out. So, the reader, I imagine them as taking the capsule of the image that then expands
Right.
inside of them, and there's a
Uh-huh.
dinosaur,
Right.
Um,
That's
and
so
so
great.
so I don't know if that works for every piece, but I do feel like something that happens, an alchemy that happens with image is that it opens inside of the reader.
Mm.
They're participating by bringing forward their own images and histories and sensory experiences to the
Hmm.
table.
Hmm.
And that offers a pathway to a deeper level of engagement. Um, so, can you sustain that um, level of density for a 20-page short story?
Mm.
I think that would be a very demanding piece to read. It might be worth
Mhm.
it, but
Right.
it would strain most readers. Maybe it's more doable in a shorter piece.
Hmm.
So we do tend to slot Flash into our experimental category as well. But sometimes we'll get longer prose pieces that maybe challenge the reader a bit
Hmm.
in terms of sustaining the conceit of the story.
Hmm.
So again, it's about risks and rewards. Like how much pressure can I put on you before I finally alienate you?
Right, right. So it sounds like with the pieces that are not fully synthesized, that maybe they're a draft or two away from
Yeah.
being ready. Would you say that that's a general problem and writers are possibly submitting work too soon?
Yeah, I think so. And that's one of the reasons we do tiered decline letters.
Mm.
So we tend to talk about 10 or 15 pieces when we're nearing our choices. So we publish 5 pieces in each category, but we use submittable to sort of isolate items that are attracting positive energy. But in our editorial meetings, where we're choosing pieces for our table of contents, anybody can bring anything to the table that they happen to love that may not have earned all the thumbs up in
Mhm.
submittable. So in some pieces that we were upset about having to say no to just this week, it often felt like it's so close, it's just a draft or two away
Mm.
from full realization. But we have the great privilege of being able to choose pieces that are just ready. And
Mhm.
so we prefer to take a non-interventionist approach to editing. Like we don't want to tinker with the writer's vision, the writer's voice. So we do have a style guide, and we make, line level edits that we think will, add a veneer of polish to the storytelling. But we don't like to have to come in and say, will you write us a new ending?
Mhm. Mhm.
Except in very rare circumstances where we're completely in love with the story,
Mhm.
but there's that maybe the final paragraph just isn't, the writer didn't stick the landing.
Right, right.
So, but yeah, I think oftentimes it's really close to being there, but not
Mhm.
quite.
Mhm.
I know as a writer, it can be very difficult to tell, when you're done.
Mhm. Yeah, sure. So what is your editorial process? Are the students involved, and how does the work sort of travel from the submittable queue to finished product?
So we have a large editorial team that's comprised of undergraduates, graduate students, and then contributing editors.
Mhm.
Um, and we make an ethical commitment to have at least 3 readers on every submission. But the reality is that it's more like 6 or 7 readers on every submission. And part of the thinking there is that some of the editors are new to the team and new to the practice of literary editing. And so we want
Mhm.
to put them in conversation with editors who have a little more experience.
Mhm.
So I read everything every time,
Mhm.
which is probably um, why I'm a stressed out person, but um, everyone participates, and I really encourage them to add notes in the submittable system to help them externalize their thinking
Mhm.
about why a piece is
Mhm.
working for them or not. And I find that that's where they really find their sea legs. Um, is they have to make determinations that incorporate their own subjective hierarchies, which they may
Mhm.
not be aware of in the
Right.
beginning. Like it turns out I really love infidelity stories. We had a lot of infidelity stories, and what else? Older men at the end of life experiencing a
Mhm.
jolt. So you'll have these weird like
Mhm.
concurrences where you get a lot of stories that tread
Right.
similar territory. And so the editors might be like, I really love infidelity stories, it turns out, but so what? Like, so you also have to think about the journal's aesthetics
Right.
and incorporate that into your picks.
Mhm.
So we might have a story that's hitting all the right notes for one editor, but it isn't a great fit for the journal. And
Mhm.
that's an interesting kind of conversation to be in, because the aesthetics of the journal don't ever have to be static.
Right.
Like need to be changing and moving all the time. But we need to be coherent enough to have an identity,
Mhm.
so that people know us when they see us, a piece that would be a Miracle Monocle piece. And so our process is to give everything at least 3 looks, but usually it's quite a few more. And
Mhm.
then we make our more final determinations sitting in a room together and talking it out.
Mhm.
Um, we also have a Discord server, so we get on there and argue with each other about final picks. Like right now, there are a few writers who really love certain picks and others who like others, and so
Mhm.
we're making arguments about why this particular piece merits inclusion. And sometimes that has to do with making sure that we have parity in terms of the writers themselves
Mhm.
in the issue. So we want to be sure that we're giving debut writers a chance to
Mhm.
reach an audience, and not just publishing folks who, have published 3 or 4 books. We want to be sure that we're, offering readers more than one perspective on the
Mhm.
world. So those are also determining factors as we're making our final picks.
Right.
And then we kind of think about like, well, how do these pieces hang with the rest of the issue as
Mhm.
well? So what's happening over in the experimental category? Are we hitting some of the same notes with these pieces that we're hitting over here with these picks? So maybe we can shuffle it up a bit. Um,
Mhm.
so it's kind of like it's very much like creating a collage, and it's
Mhm.
collaborative. And
Right.
so people are pulling forward different pieces for
Mhm.
inclusion, and we hope that we arrive at something interesting and engaging at the
Mhm.
end.
Sure.
But you kind of never really know exactly where it's going to land until
Mhm.
it happens.
Sure. Is there a variety in terms of the readers? And I think the issue of age comes up often, and I think when people hear that the readers are students or grad students, they get concerned that the
Yes.
readers won't resonate with stories about older men having a jolt late in life, or
Yeah.
so sort of like older experiences. So how do you kind of take that into consideration?
Yeah, definitely. So I do think there are some aesthetic differences in what I prefer as a reader and my students prefer.
Mhm.
And so we talk about our own subjectivities. Monocle has also played host to a number of non-traditional students, and so we
Mm.
often have fantastic members of the staff who are retired folks who are using a great benefit that the state of Kentucky offers for free tuition for those who want to go
Wow.
back to school. And so maybe they've taken a creative writing workshop or two, and then they think, reading on a journal would be, useful for their trajectory as
Mm.
writers. And so they come on the staff, and they're often, leaders and will stay on even after they've completed,
Mm.
um, reading, the class. So there's that aspect to it. I guess one of the other things is we try to talk through the utility of reading cover letters before reading a submission. So I know that sometimes if you're a young writer, you're just entering the conversation, looking at someone with a fabulous bio who's
Mm.
published everywhere and everything, it could be very challenging for them to feel authorized to say no
Yeah.
to a submission from someone with all of those credentials. And so, very many of them choose not to read the cover letters so that they're
Mm.
not biased in advance of their reading experience. But I offer them the opportunity to do that if they want to, in part so that they can begin to see what that conversation is. So, what journals are you seeing again and again and again? And what does that
Mhm.
say about the kinds of writers that are submitting to us?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, I'd also say some of our graduate students have quite a bit of editorial experience before they land on our doorstep.
Mhm.
So one of them was the editor in chief of a journal herself before stepping into this role.
Mhm.
So they do often have quite a bit of experience either working on editorial staffs of literary journals or other publications. But I very much understand the trepidation someone might have, like, okay, like
Yeah.
you're going to have a bunch of, 17-year-olds, evaluate my work. And I would say, yep, there are some very young people in the
Right.
mix. But this is how they become the editors of the future. Like this is how we keep enabling this conversation to happen beyond ourselves.
Mhm.
So there's not a lot of I don't know, economic rationale for becoming a
Mhm.
literary editor.
Mhm.
I can't tell them that there's a lucrative position waiting for them on the
Right.
other side of the experience. So they're very well aware of that. And so part of the conversation early on is why do we do this? What's the
Mhm.
point of this?
Right.
Um, and they often have really energized answers to that question that have to do with their sense that not everything need be lucrative in order
Mhm.
to have value.
Mhm.
So I feel like this generation in particular is very interested in a sort of anti-capitalist positioning
Mhm.
of the rhetoric surrounding literary journals, and they're motivated on that basis to sort of push back
Mhm.
and reassert the value of these things.
Mhm.
That wasn't that wasn't part of the conversation when I started out. And I'm not sure why. Maybe it was just a different time and there was more funding for these things.
Mhm.
But in this moment, there is often an edge to student involvement, and
Yeah,
they're
that's
very
interesting.
interested in taking the plunge as shoring up certain parts of their identities.
Mhm. Mhm. Can you talk more about lessons that you mentioned sort of importing lessons from the
Mhm.
submissions into your own craft. Can you
Mhm.
talk more about that? And also that might shed some light on what people, the types of submissions that you're seeing, sort of common missteps that writers make
Mhm.
in submissions.
So I think it's been most instructive for me as a writer recently reading in the creative nonfiction category,
Mm,
because I've been writing more in that category.
mm,
And I don't have any training in this area. I trained as a fiction writer, but one of the things that I see very frequently in reading in that category is that sometimes the writer uh, hasn't taken the time to ensure that their story of the self extends beyond the self.
mm,
Uh, so sometimes we talk about the so what factor,
mhm,
and we talk about um, how some of us will have conversations about things like our medical problems and the dreams that we've had with our friends, and they'll listen to us because they love us.
mm,
Um, but a perfect stranger, maybe he's not so interested in
right.
those things. And so I think that that is a common misstep in that category,
Mhm,
assuming reader interest and engagement with whatever
right.
area you're going to cover. So one of the things I think about and I've learned from as a principle for my own work in creative nonfiction is that most successful essays operate on three different poles.
Mm,
Um, one of which is the level of the writing itself. So if it's fantastic writing, like that's a clear advantage and an access point for readers. The other is, you know, the personal. And so you might have an essay that has elements of reporting. And so we're getting like an overview of an issue, maybe with some statistics and things like that. But the thing that's going to offer that human connection is the personal narrative. And readers are interested in knowing that, how a larger story connects to an individual.
mm,
And then the third is that larger cultural context.
mm,
So, for example, not surprisingly, we've had a higher frequency of essays that engage with questions of reproductive justice.
mm,
And it's easy to see in a story about challenges that women might face, for example, in engaging with medical practitioners,
mhm,
how that conversation extends beyond that patient, you know, doctor conversation to a much larger culture.
mhm,
But sometimes the writer doesn't make that leap.
right.
Um, and so it's about saying, um, I want you to engage with this conversation.
Mhm,
And one of the access points is I know about this because it happened to me.
right.
But also here's how it connects to you,
Mhm,
even if you don't happen to be a person with ovaries.
mhm. Yeah, that's so interesting. So it's not just the telling of the tale. It's sort of the posing some kind of larger question, larger philosophical question, or somehow leading the reader to derive some meaning from it.
Mm-hmm. And I think form comes into play there too, because we really like to offer variety on that level. So we might publish one very conventional and straightforward personal narrative. And it's generally speaking going to need to have great writing, and it's going to need to connect the self with a larger conversation. But then we might also want to publish an essay that's about the experience of teaching elementary school during the pandemic
Mhm,
as a bingo card. You
mhm,
know, so there's some formal experiment taking
right.
place that surprises the reader,
Mhm,
um, and offers an entry point to that conversation that's unique.
yeah.
So there is quite a bit of formal variety under the CNF
Mhm,
umbrella,
mhm,
and newcomers to our staff are often really surprised by that. They
yeah.
sort of think of creative nonfiction as just straightforward personal essays,
Mhm,
but we often get pieces that are really, you know, heavily reported,
right.
might contain other kinds of texts that are sort of a pastiche.
Mhm,
So um, seeing writers approach the same issue many different ways
right.
is massively useful for me as a writer,
Uh-huh.
because I can think, okay, I have something to say and I want to say
Mhm,
it. but how do I ensure that the reader's engagement? How do I get them to pay attention to me?
Yeah.
Maybe it is the container I pour it into.
Right, right. And also realizing how common, so you're trying to struggle to articulate an experience and then you open up a lit mag and see there are five other essays
Right.
on the exact same thing and maybe it's not so unique. For better or for worse, it's not so
Mhm.
unique to you. So you have to sort of figure out a way to present it that is unique.
Yeah. So there are certain pieces we see like a lot.
Mhm.
Like we get a high volume of submissions that are about the writing life. And I
Mm,
write those pieces too, but I think
right.
it really has to refresh and renew that
Hmm.
story in order to make it over the finish line.
Hmm.
Um, there's a high volume of submissions in the CNF category that are from older writers reflecting on
Mm,
the past. And that reflection is, can be very interesting, but it also needs to connect with this moment.
hmm.
So, why is the act of looking back important in this moment and
Hmm.
not just important to the speaker who's, reflecting on their own experiences
Hmm.
and trying to make meaning of them?
Yeah, you mentioned different kinds of containers too. Can you talk about common sort of structures that you're seeing? And you mentioned, I think this is so great. I might steal it, the sort of like, "Am I the asshole?" listings as a
Right. Yeah.
writing prompt. I think that's kind of brilliant. But do you see a lot of those? And do you see a lot of bingo cards? And what do you see a lot of in terms of the structure?
It's been very surprising. I love reading in the experimental category because that's the category that seems to attract the most. But
Mm,
sometimes we'll see items in creative nonfiction, like there's an essay on new motherhood that's a recipe,
mm,
and some of the ingredients are quite radical.
right, right.
Or
Great.
uh, there was one of the wildest pieces we've published was a screenplay. It's a story presented as a screenplay featuring famous dogs.
Wow.
And so it was one of those pieces where initially folks were like, "Oh, come on, like I this is ridiculous." But there was one editor on the staff who said, "No, listen, it's actually really good. Look at it." And so we did, and we realized this is an incredibly artfully
Yeah.
rendered screenplay featuring famous dogs.
Oh,
And
are the famous dogs the actors? Is that
so it's like Lassie,
oh,
those are the roles.
right.
And so it was, all the famous dogs you can think of
Mm,
are in this chorus of
mm,
voices talking about doghood and fame. And so that was an unlikely piece that we really liked. In our current issue, we have a piece that presents itself as though it's a flyer with little tear off pieces, that you
uh-huh.
see on a
Yeah.
bulletin board, but is really not that. So um, we also have seen a dramatic increase in the number of concrete poems that are coming through the transom. So poems that are, in shapes
Mm,
that connect with the content of the poem topically in some way. So we've seen quite a bit more of that.
mm,
I don't necessarily think of that as a fresh experiment, but it's one that I see happening more and
right.
more. We also see a high volume of collaborative pieces. So writers partnering, usually maybe with a writer or maybe with an artist, and somehow generating work together.
Mm,
Sometimes the artist is providing the imagery and the writer is responding and they're communicating back and forth in
mhm,
that way. So we like the idea of collaborations and attract quite a lot of them. But I think the hitch there is that the piece has to do more than just represent a conversation between those two people.
mhm,
It has to transcend the act of
mhm.
collaborating
Sure.
to reach a kind of synthesis.
Yeah. It sounds fun. So how do you balance sort of risk taking and cool experiments with the actual story that's being told? So let's say somebody has like this really cool conceit of, the screenplay written by, where the roles are famous dogs, but something is missing in terms of the execution, but it's a great idea and you sort of want to reward the
Yeah.
effort. How do you kind of tackle that as an editor?
Those are really tough conversations.
Mhm.
Sometimes an idea or a concept for a piece is just so cool that we cannot resist it,
Mhm.
and it's fun, and we like the idea of bringing some whimsy to the table.
Mhm.
Other times, there's a concept that seems really cool at first glance, but then when we return to the piece and submittable, maybe it doesn't have that depth that we're looking for.
Mhm.
So to return to an earlier conversation, we like to choose pieces when they're concept forward that reward repeat visits. So you might
Yeah.
notice different things. So it has to be densely dense enough and artfully rendered in order to pull off the magic trick of
Mhm.
presenting concept, but also like it's like a spoonful of sugar. Like
Mhm.
here's this fun concept, but actually there's the writer wants you to hear something
Mhm.
about what it's like to teach the seventh grade
Mhm.
post
Right.
pandemic.
Right.
So it, I think one of the luxuries we have is we have an entire semester to have these conversations. So something we might read in the first week of the semester and we're all gaga about, after we've completed our mission through that category, when we return to it, maybe the concept it isn't 100%. So
Mhm. Interesting.
um, we you know almost all, well, without question, return to submissions and look at them more than once,
Mhm.
and our opinions might change. So I often find myself adding, multiple comments on a piece. I love
Mhm.
this the first read, but now I'm back. I've seen what
Mhm.
else is out there, and I feel like this is doing something similar and maybe a little
Mhm.
more interesting.
Mhm.
Um, and sometimes our staff members have really strong opinions that will sway me one way or the other, or I'll work to sway them one way or
Mhm.
the other.
So do you wait through the whole submission cycle before making final decisions? And also relatedly, when is your submission cycle?
So our smaller categories are creative nonfiction and experimental. So we just, for whatever reason, attract fewer submissions in those categories, and so those are generally the ones we turn around more quickly. So we'll have read all the way through those submissions within the first month or so of the semester, and we'll start having those conversations about what's going to make it to the table of contents at that time. And
Mhm.
then we're continuing to read in poetry and fiction, which are giant slices of the submission
Mhm.
pie, while we do that. And then those conversations happen a little past the midpoint of the semester. So we're having those conversations now.
Mhm.
And then we shift gears into producing the issue. So we're preparing manuscripts for publication. We're getting all of our paperwork in line. This is a little dorky, but we like to print manuscripts out and edit them on paper with
Mhm.
pens in the first
Great.
round. We just catch more stuff that way.
Sure.
And then we start editing in the cloud. And at
Mhm.
a certain point, we get the writer in the conversation. They can make any adjustments they want. And then we launch the issue.
Mhm.
So we are slated to launch our next issue in the last week of April.
Mhm.
And then we'll reopen for submissions in August.
Okay. Is there anything in particular that you are actively looking for in submissions? Are you seeking more experimental work, more hybrid work? Anything you can tell our audience to send out?
Yeah, so for August, we would really love to see a higher volume of experimental work.
Mhm.
So I probably shouldn't reveal this, but it's our favorite category to read. We really love reading
Mhm.
work in that category because we never know what we're going to get when we open a submission. Um, that said, we do want to welcome folks who are writing, straight up traditional realism. Like we
Mhm.
really love an immersive storytelling experience. Um, in the poetry category, we really love to see a variety within a packet of formal approaches.
Mhm.
But if a writer has a very specific project, like for example, I encountered an item in the submission queue. Um, it was a series of zombie poems.
Mhm.
And so, having several pieces in that modality to choose from
Mhm.
is advantageous because then we can show readers what you're doing in different poems, with the same concept.
Mhm.
Um, so I think pulling together a packet that shows a bit of range is
Yeah.
advantageous, but we also, want to make sure our readers understand what you're trying to do.
Mhm.
So there's that. For creative nonfiction, I guess one thing I would caution against is sending us political diatribes,
Mhm.
for lack of a better word. Like
Mhm.
we care about all of this stuff. It's just that there are so many venues for that already on the
Yeah.
internet, and so we want to have a different kind of conversation in the journal, and we
Mhm.
don't, want to be anti this or pro this or
Mhm.
any of that.
Mhm.
That said, we understand that almost anything you write has a political aspect. And so we
Mhm.
would never want anyone to like submerge themselves for submission purposes.
Right.
But I'd say if you're engaging with the news story that's happening on the screen at that
Mhm.
moment,
Mhm.
by the time it reaches readers, it will no longer be in the cultural memory.
Right. Right.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
So what else? What categories have I skipped? We talked quite a lot about fiction. I would say within the experimental category, we we like to publish. So I see the Flash category as operating in a couple, like there are a couple of different things under the Flash umbrella. So some flash fiction is sort of extraordinarily dense on a lyrical level. And
Mhm.
so the writer's trying to forge synthesis on the level of image,
Mhm.
word choice. Others are just very, very short stories.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
we like to see both.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so we're going to publish a few pieces of flash in each issue, and we don't want them all to be one or the other.
Right.
So we like to see very, very short stories, and it's amazing what writers can pull off in just a few paragraphs.
Mhm.
Um, but we also like to see pieces that sort of reach into the poetry side of things,
Mhm. Mhm.
to pull off the magic trick of satisfying a reader in just a couple
Yeah.
of paragraphs.
It is a magic trick. So one final question. This has been so great. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
This is a question that I ask all editors and just generally what keeps you motivated, what keeps you inspired. We know it's a lot of work, probably not a lot of money in it. And we know editors, you have other obligations, family, teaching, all this other stuff. So what keeps you excited about running a literary magazine?
Part of it is just the energy that comes out of creating collaborative art.
Hmm.
So I'm coming together with the staff, and we're coming together with all of these prospective contributors to make something that's cool
Yeah.
and has energy, and interacting with both parties, both the staff and the contributors, is
Right.
just where I get my life energy from. And so
Right.
there are aspects of the job that are less fun, and more bureaucratic. I work in academia, so there's going to be some bureaucracy,
Right.
but I'm motivated to surmount those obstacles because it means I get to continue working with all of these great people,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
seeing them do amazing things.
Yeah.
So I love an opportunity to visit with a writer maybe I've seen in some other context,
Mm.
serve up something totally unexpected of them and new, and that's super exciting. I also love putting a challenge in front of an editor and seeing what they can do with it.
Mm.
So occasionally we'll do digital roundtables on certain subjects like eco poetry, neurodivergency in the writing space. So I'll put that opportunity in front of an editor, and they'll pull something amazing together
Mm.
that enhances the journal.
Mm.
Um, I like being
So sorry,
open.
can you clarify? So you sort of like will ask an editor to write on this topic? Is that?
I'll ask them to bring together maybe three, four writers who are working in this
Oh, I
space.
see. Okay.
And so they'll have a conversation with each other.
Hmm.
The editor will facilitate it, and then we'll
Hmm.
put together a nicely designed package that'll be available for download with the
Hmm.
issue. So it's just a little added bell and whistle
Yeah.
on the issue cycle. It's really fun and offers us a different way of engaging with readers.
Hmm.
Um, our reviews category is so exciting for the same reason. So
Hmm.
um, reviews are tricky documents to write, and so oftentimes our contributors are writing them or for the first time,
Hmm.
their first byline, and they do amazing work and draw attention, much needed attention to small press
Hmm.
books. So that's exciting too. So that's what keeps me going.
Yeah.
So there's
That's great. Yeah.
every issue cycle offers new surprises, that's for
Uh-huh.
sure.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you, Sarah. This has been great. Thank you, everyone, for
Thank
coming.
you so much.